Namaste, my friends. Welcome to Jack Colley's Black Book. This is episode 39, and today is September 11 of 2024. And I say that date intentionally because we cannot say that date anymore and have people simply say, oh, yeah, it's September 11. You can't accept that even casually anymore because when that date is stated, September 11, we have emblazoned upon our collective unconscious that there is something associated with that there is evil, there's terrorism associated with that, there's loss, there's mourning. There are all sorts of things associated with September 11 and the terrorist attacks. And this is where I want to process today. There's a page in my Black Book that explored this idea of a response to 9/11 that quite honestly would be a response that is probably never going to happen. And yet at the same time, as I play this response out in my mind, I can't help but think, but maybe if I shared this idea, perhaps we can think about things a little bit differently so that if something like this happens again, maybe we have a different approach, or maybe it gives us pause to maybe solve the problem differently. I'm not sure, other than to say there's something about this idea that I think could be valuable in helping us conceptualize the terrorist attacks in a different way, in a subtly different way. So what I would like to do is I'm going to start with crunching some numbers or stating some numbers to kind of build a framework for my suggestion, for my argument, in hopes that we can maybe change how we respond to things. So that's my goal today. On September 11, almost 3,000 people died. According to the figures that I found, it was 2,977 Americans and 19 terrorists. I remember where I was at. I was teaching in my then fifth grade classroom, and we had gotten televisions in each classroom. This was something new to have televisions in each classroom. And we had gotten an announcement over the intercom, teachers, please check your emails. And we all checked our emails. And of course, it said, there are some terrorist attacks going on, or there are some things happening nationally that we don't want the students to see, so please keep your televisions off. Well, at the time that I received the email, I happened to not have students. And so, of course, I wanted to see what was going on. So I turned on the television and I saw the Twin Towers smoking, and I heard the live reports, and I can't even, I'm even having a visceral reaction right now, like I'm getting goosebumps right now just thinking about it, because I remember sitting there thinking, oh my goodness, what is happening here? Well, what is this all about? What is this level of evil? What is this thing that we would have never expected to happen? And now it's on our TV screens, and there's people being brought out, and we know that there's dead people. We know that there are people in the two Twin Towers. I mean, we know all of this, and I'm watching this, and it was almost like, it was almost otherworldly. It was almost like I was having an out-of-body experience watching this unfold. And of course, later the numbers would come out. So 2,977 dead, 19 of, in addition, 19 terrorists. What often happens is in our Western culture, we automatically jump to, if violence is done to us, we're going to do violence to others. Now, I want to be really careful here because I'm not a politician. There's a difference between how the world functions and how the spiritual world functions. I am certainly not in any position to say that we should, the way our government should have responded or should not have responded. My goal here is to present a framework and to get us thinking about things differently, which is really my goal with all of these broadcasts that I do, is I'm trying to get people to think bigger. I'm trying to get people to carry things to the next level so we can have a deeper understanding, so that maybe it changes our approach or our response to something. But of course, very soon after, we declared war on Afghanistan, and the Afghanistan war would see 2,500 of our military personnel dead and 21,000 wounded. Now, I don't know if these are exact numbers. I rounded them. I tried to get, reputable websites, but it's not so much about the accuracy of the numbers here as much as setting up this pattern that I see that I think we want to address. So from there, this I want to add too. So I also don't want to forget the 70,000 Afghan and Pakistanis who died because of this. And I'm not saying that one nationality is more important than another or anything like that. I'm not trying to put anything on equal. I'm not trying to do that. I want to just acknowledge that there were 70,000 Afghan and Pakistani lives that were lost. Now, very soon after, I believe it was George Bush, President George Bush, defined for the American people the axis of evil. And the axis of evil, if you remember, was Iraq, Iran, and Afghanistan. And what we were looking for was weapons of mass destruction, particularly with Iraq. And once again, we have this pattern where politicians will step into an already horrible situation and try to push their agenda via an already horrible situation that happened to the citizens, to the people. And so now we have the axis of evil, and things begin to start breaking down because now we have disagreements between the parties. We have disagreements between how we should handle this. How long is this going to last? Where's the next war we're going to get involved in? Suddenly, we are missing out on some of the unity we experienced, and we'll get here in a minute, but some of the unity we experienced on September 12th, the day after September 11. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. So the Iraq war comes around, and the numbers that I found were 4,400 U.S. military dead, 32,000 wounded, and I found some estimates of 110,000 people dead, whether Americans, Iraqi, and some of them were higher than that. I mean, some estimates, and again, I don't know if they're sensationalized because people want to make a point. I'm sure that that's part of it, but some estimates went up to the 180,000 mark. So I chose a number that just seemed to pop up on reasonable websites. So all of this happens. Now, here's where I want to take a little bit of a tangent because I think this is incredibly important. Another number that I want people to be aware of that we think stems directly from 9/11 is that the military suicide rate increased to 30,177 documented cases of military individuals who committed suicide. And we noticed an uptick. So it went from something like 1 in 100,000 suicides to like 15 in 100,000 suicides. And that gives us, somebody like me who will work with individuals with PTSD, it makes me pause and think, what changed? So I'm going to go off on a little tangent here and just challenge, what's happening here. Because when I think of my grandfather who was in the Army, and I think about my dad who was in the Marines, the thing that comes to mind is, number one, I remember both of them teaching me that war is horrible, that war is, it's horrible, it shouldn't be that way. I remember them teaching me that. I also remember that it seemed to me that their motive for getting involved in military service was something that you did for your country. It was something honorable. And I think that there's something about this that I think my fellow professors need to investigate more, because it seemed to me that my grandfather and father were prepared to enter the military, and they fully understood that they may have to sacrifice a limb, or they may have to sacrifice their life. They may have to live with the reality that they killed somebody. They may have to leave their families without a father or a grandfather. It seems like they knew the risk and they went into it being more prepared. And then what happened was a good year or so ago, I had a client who I was working with, PTSD, and he was in the Iraqi war, and he was having trouble sleeping because he kept waking up to these visions or to these memories of him being in a foxhole in a situation, and he saw the tracers being flown overhead. So if and I had to educate myself because he would share these things, and I'd have to then get online and figure, okay, what are these tracer things? So my understanding of a tracer is that every third or fourth bullet of an artillery gun is actually like a little flare, so that the people shooting the gun can aim the heavy artillery and see where the bullets are going. So every third, fourth, fifth, I don't know what the ratio is like this little tiny bullet that's actually a flare, and that allows the shooter to steer is it called the turret or something like that. And this was his recurring nightmare. This is why he could not handle fireworks. He couldn't handle loud noises. He couldn't handle waking up in the middle of the night because he would wake up thinking he was in the foxhole. So this was a pretty severe case of PTSD. And I helped this individual. And one of the things we explored is, how were you prepared for this reality that you would have to potentially face? And it turned out that, in my opinion, in my estimation, he wasn't prepared very well. And then I started thinking about my son. We're going to call him Sydney in this broadcast because I have different names for the important people in my life. But my son Sydney, when he was in high school, he was approached by a military recruiter who they can go to high school campuses and they can meet with kids in the mall. And he tried to get my son to apply for the military, to make a commitment to educate him. And when my son came home, he was, I wouldn't say he was excited about it or anything like that, but the way he presented it was, yeah, you can join the military and you can get an education for free. And it's an adventure and you can see the world. And I'm listening to Sydney portray how this was presented to him. In the background, I'm thinking about my grandfather and my dad, who joined the military for very different reasons than you get a free education and you get to see the world. And a part of me was angry at this military recruiter. And a part of me was angry at our government that we would approach a 21-year-old or a 19, well, he would have been like a 17-year-old if he was in high school. And we would paint this picture that this is an adventure, and it wouldn't be anything about honor and your responsibility to give part of yourself to your country. It would be about having an adventure. I mean, it was almost like the military recruiter was trying to sell him a fucking vacation. You know, it's like you get to see the world and you get a free education and you get all of this adventure. And nobody said, you might lose a limb. You might have to give your life. Your family might have to live without you. You might leave a spouse at home who has to mourn you. You might leave kids at home. This is serious. It's much more serious. And sometimes I wonder if when we present military service to our young men and women, and their only context is a video game where you get to be the soldier and you get to shoot everything up. And if you get shot, well, you get to hit the fucking reset button. I mean, can we be serious about this? That is their only, that's their only framework for war and violence, is a video game. And then we come along and we can say, oh, you can join the military and yeah, you get to see the world. You get these great adventures. You get training. You get education, and all of that is good. I'm glad that we do that. But at the same time, can we please start being honest about the level of honor and the level of decision making that individuals have to make when they join the military? That it's not about all the good stuff. you also have to be prepared to give your life. And I say that in a spirit of recognizing that every culture has to have a warrior class. I wish it was not that way, but every culture has to have a warrior class. And so, in that sense, I'm very thankful to my grandfather who was in the Army and my dad who was in the Marines. I have trouble conceptualizing they how they reconciled their Christianity with their military service. I have trouble reconciling that, and yet at the same time, I don't know how else you would do it. I don't know how else we would survive, or cultures would survive and protect themselves without, the warrior class. And so I think that that's important to recognize. But I often wonder, is that part of the reason why we saw suicide rates increase significantly? I think 15-fold. Is that a reason where we sent these young men and young women into combat situations, and they were not prepared for what it might be like to take life, what it might be like to see life taken? They were not prepared for the experience they had. And I'm just not sure about that. But that's just a tangent that I thought was important. Here's where I want to go next. So 9/11 happened. 9/12 comes around. And I remember September 12. I remember September 13, September 14. I remember that there were certain things that happened for us as a nation and a culture that were simply exceptional, certainly different than what we're experiencing now in this close to the 2024 election period. On September 12, 13, 14, we were all mourning together. Like I couldn't think of anybody who was walking around saying, being flippant about what happened. We were all mourning together. On September 12, 13, 14, right after 9/11, there was no distinction between Republican and Democrat. I get choked up thinking about this because I see the ugliness that politics and division is having on us as a country. And there was no conservative or liberal. We worked together. I love what Fred Rogers said his mother taught him, Mr. Rogers. He said, when something bad happens, don't look at all the pain, look at who's helping. I mean, think about the days after 9/11. Think about our first responders, thousands of which are still dealing with health problems and the government not giving them health care that they need to be well. We helped each other. We organized. We had empathy for one another despite our political backgrounds. We were graceful with one another. Like it didn't matter. We didn't ask who was on government assistance and who was in this category and who was. We helped each other. And as much as it pains me to say that it's unfortunate that it took 9/11 to get us to that point, can we at least recognize that we were very unified at that point? We realized that suffering was optional. And that is one thing about, the Western culture, the American culture, is that we can say suffering is optional. We're going to deal with this. We're going to take care of things. It's just that beautiful time period where we came together over something horrible. So let's continue. George Bush comes along. This is September 20. And George Bush says, our war on terror begins with Al-Qaeda, but it does not end there. It will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated. Now, I actually like this quote. That may surprise some of you who know me, but I actually like this quote. The only distinction is I would interpret the term war as not necessarily meaning violence. When you are at war with something, it can mean all different things to be at war with something. So when I look at George W. Bush's quote here, and if I can just play a little bit on the word war, I really like what he is doing here because he's focused on Al-Qaeda. He's focused on the terrorist. He's saying, we're going to take care of this problem. He's saying we're going to continue to take care of this problem. The only question that I'm raising is, did we have to take care of it in a way that resulted in hundreds and thousands of more deaths from 3,000? That's where we're going with this. So let's just continue here. What if on September 13, we forgave, but we committed to never forgetting, but still committed to become even stronger? So when you look at the changes that took place from September 11, out of September 11, increased security at airports, more monitoring of, I guess, suspicious behavior, whether you appreciate that or not. I know some people are concerned about that, but there were some changes that took place out of this. Could we have implemented all of the changes that we made, perhaps without involving ourselves in ways that resulted in hundreds and thousands of more deaths, not only of Americans, but of non-Americans? What if we said, no, we're still going to hold terrorists accountable. We're still going to remove them from the earth. We're still going to take care of the problem. But, and when I say remove them from the earth, I'm talking about incarceration. I'm not a fan of the death penalty. I'm just not, or assassinate, or and anyway, hopefully you pick up on that distinction. So, but removing them from society, removing them from having an influence. Could we have done that in a way that the vast number of lives may not have been lost? I'm not a politician. I'm not an expert on world. I'm not. So I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's a question that I at least want to raise. So here's where I've landed. So here's kind of just some thoughts. I think we have to consider the victims. I think we have to consider the 99%. I think we need to do a better job of this in our spiritual institutions, in our religious institutions, because often, particularly in the West, often, for example, I'll hear prayers for Israel, and I won't hear prayers for Pakistan. And I'm not, I don't understand the Middle East. I can't explain to you, nor can most Christians, as far as I'm concerned, are not going to be able to explain why we would pray for Israel, but not for Pakistan. But what I would like to do is, could we all agree that we have to shift our focus from the politicians and the violence that most of the people in these countries are not committing? When we pray for Israel, can we specifically pray for the individuals who did nothing against us except were born there? And the same thing with Pakistan. Can we at least pray for the individuals in Pakistan who did nothing against us other than be born there? Can we get all of them help? Can we shift our focus from defining everything by what military action and politicians do to who should we really be praying for? Who should we be focused on? And I think when you look at the Christian faith, I think it's pretty clear what groups of individuals we're focused on. And at least in the life of Jesus the Christ, it was not the violent individuals. It was the people on the fringe. It was the people who often didn't have control over their situation. We know what happens when we limit our response options to violence. Can we start getting away from this assumption that when violence happens, we have to respond to violence? Can we understand that, I love this quote here, an eye for an eye is just going to leave the world blind. Like if we keep this mentality of, if you take my eye, I'm going to take your eye, and then they're going to take this eye, and then before you know it, the whole world is going to be blind. I've already talked about my assumption that there's a necessity for a warrior class. So I kind of talked about that already. Here is an important thing I want to point out. We can see perhaps in all conflict that not only does violence not seem to stop violence, it seems to increase violence, particularly the loss of life. And that's where I kind of get the eye for eye thing. It's like, okay, we lost 3,000 Americans, and then we go to war in Afghanistan, and true, 70,000 Afghans lost their lives. And I don't know if those are soldiers, civilians, or what, but an additional 2,500 Americans lost their lives. And I just think, do we see that our reaction, whether right or wrong, whether necessary or not, can we acknowledge that it resulted in more death, more Americans' death? So after Afghanistan, now we're up to not only the 3,000 from 9/11, now we're up to 5,500, if I'm doing the math correctly. So here's why I think it's important to say, let's try to look at things different, because it seems to me that in every situation, even situation where I'm working with clients and patients and they've been the victim of violence, it seems that the result is exponential. It's not linear. It's not like you took 3,000 American lives, so we're going to take 3,000 Afghan lives. Like, the math doesn't work that way when it comes to violence. It's exponential. It's a hyperbolic curve that results. That we start with 3,000 deaths, which was horrible, and people need to be held accountable, and we can't forget we have to do things different, and we have done a lot of things different to be more secure, and we have to rely on our warrior class, et cetera, et cetera. But there's this reality of the trajectory, which is we started with 3,000 deaths, and because we had to, I don't know if it's a have to, but I think most people would say, well, we had to do something, but it resulted in 2,500 more American deaths. Is there a possibility that it could have been done differently? I'm not sure. I don't know. And then I just have a statement here. And I want to read this because everything that I do on these podcasts, I get that sometimes it sounds like I'm being overly critical, and I am critiquing, but I like to think that my goal is not to be critical in an effort to get rid of something. My goal in critiquing something is to make it better. And I even think, I think about this. This just came to mind, when Rabbi Jesus said, I've not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. It's kind of that idea that I'm not here to abolish anything. I'm here to say, okay, let's look at what we may have to have, the way we have to respond. I don't know. I'm not a politician. I'm not a political science expert. But let's see if we can make the process better so that maybe we don't end up losing literally hundreds of thousands of lives, so that we don't end up with a warrior class where the suicide rate has gone up 15 times. Let's try to do something different so we don't have first responders that are still fighting lung cancer and illness. So anyway, I've got this statement. I acknowledge that there's a different process for the spiritual world as compared to the temporal world. This is particularly true in Western culture and religions that claim a distinction between the spiritual and the temporal. I am suggesting that we contemplate how the practice of forgiveness in the spiritual world might help us in the temporal world. And so what do I mean by that is this. In no way am I saying we should just forgive and look the other way. I don't think that's realistic. And if you watch my podcasts my previous podcasts, a few of them about forgiveness, you'll know that I believe it's possible to forgive and still hold people accountable, still change your position. And I think it's appropriate to do that. But what if we didn't forget, but we looked at how this idea of forgiveness might help? What if we looked at the situation in a little bit different light? That if hundreds and thousands of people are going to die, what if we strongly considered not just a numbers game, but what if we considered that the vast majority of those individuals did nothing to us other than they were born where they were born? And what does that mean for our first responders, for our warrior class, which now has the highest suicide rate that it's ever had? What does it mean if we can apply that element of forgiveness? Maybe it's just enough to give us pause. And holy cow, this is going long. This is like turning into a whole college lecture here. But here's what I came up with, and here's where I want to end, because it's very unlikely that if something like this happens again, I don't expect any country, any government to say, oh, we forgive you, don't worry about it. That would be an insane, ridiculous response. But at the same time, if we can consider how forgiveness might play a role in even the most horrendous of situations, while still holding people accountable, while still protecting ourselves, while still making sure we have a strong military defense for our country, etc., so on and so forth. It may sound ridiculous, but here's where I want to leave off. Just because something is unlikely does not mean it's necessarily a bad idea. And so I hope on today, September 11, maybe we can consider what the role of forgiveness, how that might temper, how that may have interrupted the cycle, how that may have changed the numbers. So anyway, that's my thought on that. I hope it was clear. Sorry it was long, but there you go. All right, namaste, my friends, and I'll see you the next time.